Just hours ago, the president of Israel formally invited Benjamin Netanyahu to form the country's next government. That means Bibi has 28 days to satisfy the demands of his allies with choice ministries and favored policies to keep the narrow majority of his coalition in the Knesset intact. And those allies include a motley crew of far-right politicians. Depending on how these negotiations turn out, Netanyahu could form the most right-wing government in Israel's history. To talk us through what this means for Israel and the world, Anshel Pfeffer joins me now. He is a Jerusalem-based correspondent for both Haaretz and The Economist, and the author of the book Bibi, The Turbulent Life and Times of Benjamin Netanyahu. Anshel, thank you so much for coming on. I'd like to say you wrote the initial Bibi book before Netanyahu called his book Bibi. So welcome back to the program. So explain to us what this new far-right coalition, Israel's most religious, would look like for the body politic of the country, especially given that it's coming on the heels of what was the most diverse Knesset in Israel's history.
So first of all, the coalition does not yet exist as such. Netanyahu received today the mandate from the president, but that's a mandate to now try and form a coalition. He's got 4 weeks to negotiate with potential partners, and then once he's agreed with those partners, then he can go to the Knesset and swear in his new government. But it's a shopping list of demands that he now has to go through, which his various partners are presenting him with. And as you say, that could change Israel in many different ways. For a start, they're talking about changing the balance between the judiciary and the parliament and the Knesset that will give basically the Knesset the what's called an overriding clause, will allow them with just a regular majority to basically cancel any Supreme Court ruling against government actions or government legislation. So that's going to open up the way for them to pass whatever kinds of laws they want to pass, and there's talk about laws which will change the definition of what it even means to be Jewish for immigration to Israel. That's going to be a huge issue for Jewish communities in diaspora who are not being consulted on this. And this, obviously, the guidelines or the specifications of who can be an Israeli Jew will be changed in line with both far-right and radical Orthodox rulings. There's going to be changes in the way that, for example, in the way that religious schools are financed. They won't have to conform to any standards of curriculum. And then there's the question of what roles will the leaders of the far-right parties in the new government, what roles will they have in the cabinet? They're angling for very senior positions. They're talking about the defense ministry, they're talking about public security, which controls the police, education. So all these things will have quite a major impact on Israel going forward.
Yeah, significant impact at that. Correct me if I'm wrong, Anshel. I know that the turnout was very high, but I read 11% of Israelis voted for religious Zionism-focused parties. That includes parties that support Jewish power. In a country where 20% of the population is Arab, how significant of a figure is that?
So 11% for religious Zionism is more than double what they got last time. Religious Zionism, just to explain, is a list of candidates who represent 3 different far-right parties. One of them, as you said, is Jewish Power. The 2 other parties in that joint list are also quite radical. What this means for the 21% of Arab Israeli citizens, it's hard to say at this point, because mainly the policies they're talking about are focused more on Jewish issues, not so much on non-Jewish issues in Israel. But once those ministers, those leaders of those parties will become ministers in the government, if they indeed get control of the public security ministry, that could have a lot of implications also for non-Jewish Israelis on anything to do with law enforcement, the way the police act towards citizens, the way the police will try and maintain order in places like Temple Mount, around the Al-Aqsa mosques, where there already is quite a lot of tension. All these things are, we're going to be basically in uncharted territory, because we've never had a very far-right party in charge of these affairs.
And clearly that would garner a response and reaction if this government is formed from allies of Israel and foes alike. But when it comes to the United States, one of your colleagues at Haaretz wrote a piece called "Bibi is one of the losers in the U.S. election," suggesting that Bibi had been hoping for more of that red wave that many had anticipated in the United States in these midterms. Do you agree with that assessment? And given the results that we've seen, how much pressure could a President Biden put on a newly formed government under Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Well, we know that President Biden, like any president, has a limited bandwidth. Even the most powerful man in the world, or the leader of the free world, can't push on all fronts, both in domestic and foreign policy. And when a U.S. president has issues at home or doesn't have control of both houses of Congress, it makes that president also weaker when it comes to foreign policy, especially if it's a foreign policy which is divisive at home. And the Republican Party is much more pro-Netanyahu, while the Democrats, I think, are still pro-Israel, but they're certainly not pro-Netanyahu. So for Joe Biden to have emerged from the midterms as he has, with not having suffered the setbacks that were being predicted just a few days ago, means that he will certainly have more. He'll have more political capital to put pressure on Israel, which he probably wouldn't have done if he'd have to constantly be looking over his shoulder at a Republican Congress and Senate who are very pro-Netanyahu. Now, one of the main issues here is not so much where will America continue supporting Israel, because I think it's a given that America will, but the level of cooperation between various departments of the administration and their Israeli counterparts. Now, if, for example, Bezalel Smotrich, who is one of the leaders of religious Zionism, becomes defense minister, so the whole coordination between the Israeli defense establishment and the Pentagon is not as easy as it was before, because this is a channel which the two defense establishments have had for decades. It's been based on trust. It's been based on the fact that the men in charge, and it's always been men, what can we say? Yeah. The men in charge of the Pentagon and the Israeli Defense Ministry have been able to have very close levels of coordination and trust. And once the man on the Israeli side is a far-right politician, someone who the Biden administration has already spoken out against, I think that's going to be much more difficult.
Yeah, it raises so many questions. He's currently on trial for corruption charges. What happens with the Palestinian issue? All of that we will hopefully have you back on soon to discuss. Anshel Pfeffer, thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Yeah.
Well, next on GPS, should rich countries compensate developing nations for the impacts of climate change? It's been a major issue at this year's UN Climate Conference. We'll discuss when we come back.